Today we are going to discuss on the first part of grief and bereavement. We do have Ms. Smriti Rana join with us to walk us through this session. Without further delays, I hand over to her. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thanks. And I apologize for the change in scheduling from last week. Senior, are we expecting more people to join?
Yes, ma'am. Only 34 have joined. We have around 60-70 people joining us.
Okay, so let's just wait a few more minutes. Can I also request for more cameras to be turned on, please, if that's possible for people with enough bandwidth? Great. So while we wait for the others to join us, I think, the topics we're covering over the next two sessions, grief and bereavement, I don't think there's anybody in this room who is a stranger to this experience. If you have experienced love, you have experienced loss, and therefore you have experienced grief and bereavement as well. So we will break it down into parts that, we'll talk about it more theoretically, and we look at it from the point of view of certain frameworks and theories. And then by Friday, we will also go into a deeper dive into what bereavement looks like, and some of the ways in which we in this field can be of use to other people who are grieving, and also perhaps use it as a way to process our own grief and our own post-bereavement lives. So as always, I will encourage interaction through the chat box, and we will pause from time to time to take a sense of what's happening in the room and what's in people's minds and hearts. This is, I'm sure, not an easy topic for some folks. And if you find that you are getting triggered by what is being discussed, I will request you to, to let one of us know privately, either Senior or me, or I think Shri Priya is also here. So do reach out. This is not, like I said, this is not an easy topic for some people, but we're going to look at it more from the framework point of view. Okay, so let me just get started. Senior, I just need 1 second. I'm just finalizing something. Just one. Okay. So we're going to break it down across the two sections of grief and bereavement. And let's just get started. Okay, so grief and the rituals of mourning are healthy adaptations to loss. I want us to just sit with this for a second. Grief is not a pathological experience. It is a natural experience. In fact, the experience of grief is a healthy one. And there are various rituals and, ceremonies and things like that that have evolved across different cultures that help us go through this process of grief. So let's just quickly, take a look. What are some of the rituals of mourning that have evolved over different societies, over different cultures? Some of us have a 13-day ceremony that we do. I mean, on the 13th day. There are cultures that do something on the 4th day, on the 7th day. There are certain rituals around family. So would anyone like to share from perhaps your experience? What are some of the rituals that you have in your communities? And how, in your opinion, do these help with the process of grief and mourning? Okay, I'll give you an example. We have a thing in our family, in our community, where for 4 days after the person has died, we don't cook at home. and you're not supposed to fire up the kitchen for about 4 days. Now, even though that is a ritual, what that really serves is to give the family some rest, that you don't have to worry about cooking for visitors. Instead, what happens is that other people bring food and other people make sure that the family is fed. So it takes a big chunk of that burden off of you. So while it is a ritual that has emerged as a morning ritual, it does have a practical purpose to it as well. So any others?
The daughters of the family have to all come together and during the day at least, and be with families. That would help social support at that time. Having said that, the sons have a very difficult time at that time because they can't touch anybody. They have to cook for themselves, although things are changing now. But they have to do all the household work. Like, I don't know, nobody else can touch them. They can't touch their clothes. So they have to wash their clothes and then do that. So maybe some of them are good, but not all rituals are beneficial.
Yeah. Isha, are you Nepali?
Yes.
Even though
We have that. All right, go on, please.
no, even though people just initially they were considered as orthodox rituals, but when we see the aspects of the psychological benefits from not cooking the food or not being touched by the other people or leaving some people aloof, it's a kind of grief coping strategies, I think, scientifically, which has a lot of significance. But people are just considering at some point as orthodox, and but when they know the actual meaning and the significance of why they have to undergo, and it could be much better for them to cope up in a healthy manner, I would
Yeah.
say.
It depends. I suppose it also depends on how these are interpreted in different cultures. If people are just dogmatic about it without going into why these are helpful, then maybe it can come across as quite oppressive. And Isha, I'm quite familiar with what you just described as the son of the house being kept separate. But I've heard it say that, thank God, I really don't want to talk to any people. So at least this is a great excuse for people not to talk to me. And that was something I heard from within my family. So yeah, okay. So there are various things. There are also rituals around cooking food that that the person who died has liked, their favorite food, and there are many ways in which these rituals have been incorporated into cultural ways of mourning, and they also give us, I think, they give us a roadmap. Why 13 days? Why 4 days? Yes, there is a spiritual angle to it. There are across cultures, whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, even in Judaism and Christianity and Islam and stuff, there are certain number of days, etc. And I suppose it also helps with the mourning process when we interpret rituals in that way. So there are also many ways in which we can offer peace to the departed, whether it's in the form of performing a ceremony, or the way in which maybe in some communities on the 13th day we are asked to feed other members of the community who are less privileged, and so on. So rituals of mourning and grief are, grief is a healthy response to loss, and rituals of mourning have been devised and designed over millennia just to help us go through this process. Okay. Now, I just want to clarify, we will be talking about bereavement specifically on Friday, but today we're going to talk about grief in general. Now, grief is associated with loss, and it is not only the death of a person that we're talking about. We're talking about the various types of losses that people encounter. And because we are a palliative care organization, and we're talking about this through a palliative care lens, let's look at what are some of the losses that people experience, not just at the time of someone's death, but also over a period of the illness. What are some of the losses? And these are losses that are experienced both by the family members as well as the patient. So let's hear from everybody. What are the types of losses that people might experience over the course of their illness? Floor's open.
Loss of independence, loss of dignity at times, loss of their routine life, loss of work professionally.
Financial concerns.
Yeah, okay. Well, that you've packed in quite a bit. The independence, dignity, routine, autonomy, control, financial independence, your role as a breadwinner. Yeah, go on. What else? And each of these losses are huge. If you look at them as singular pieces, each of these are huge. So let's go through them one by one. You've already covered quite a few. Identity and customary roles. If I were to ask you all today, who are you? How would you introduce yourself? How would you introduce yourselves if we were meeting properly for the first time, and you had to introduce yourself to me and I had to introduce myself to you? Loss of belonging to the family. Yes, Geeta, that's a very poignant loss. So if you were to introduce yourself, how would you typically introduce yourself?
You'd say your name, where you're from, what your profession is, and I don't know, where you live, I guess. Maybe if your interest areas, if the conversation lengthens.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of people would introduce themselves as, for example, I'm the mother of two really naughty toddlers, or someone might introduce himself as, the husband of, or someone might introduce them, like you said, by their professional roles. So there is always a dynamic interchange between us and something else when our identity is not something that exists in a vacuum. It exists in relation to something or someone else. And illness really takes a toll on that. So our identity, especially if, for example, the patient has been the head of the family, and not just the male head, but just the matriarch of the family, and is the one who runs the household, who makes very important decisions, and this illness comes along and takes that capacity away from them. And all of a sudden, this person is now at the mercy of the entire system, and is no longer the prime decision maker. Finances is no longer the breadwinner, perhaps. The loss of these identities and customary roles is a huge hit to our sense of self. The loss of physical function, not being able to move around like you used to, not being able to.
Ma'am, can you please increase your volume by a bit?
My volume?
Yes.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay, so I was saying that even people lose their physical function, right? So your ability to move around perhaps by yourself, not being able to do certain tasks physically, like maybe use the toilet or have a bath without help. Some people lose functionality in terms of mobility, in terms of their ability to breathe without support. And all of these losses are things that are to be grieved. People who have not been able to, who are not able to drive themselves around anymore, people who are not able to go out and take a walk. So all of these losses are losses that are individually grieved by people. Relationships. Why would we lose relationships when there is an illness? Why would be there a loss of relationships? Anyone? Anyone who hasn't spoken yet, perhaps? Isha, but go ahead. I saw you on. Go ahead.
With every relationship, there comes a responsibility as well. Like if I'm a mother and if I have, I don't know, if my children are going for a loss, then if I'm sick, I won't be able to take care of them. Even in a social framework, you can't go out, meet people that often because mobility is a problem. And you're not feeling well yourself, and so many things are wrong with you. And perhaps your family also discourages, because if you're sick, there's more chances of infection and things like that. So you kind of start isolating yourself. If anyone's sick in the family, okay, don't go next to so and so. And that, in a large run, takes a toll on your life altogether.
Perfect. I think that's a great answer. And I can see in the chat box some additions to it. Some spouses leave. There is something like a 40% abandonment statistic amongst women with cervical cancer. Did you know that? Approximately 40% of women with cervical cancer are abandoned by their spouses. Cervical cancer is something that affects women in their genitals. It is a highly stigmatized illness. And it has a lot of, malodorous discharge, all sorts of things. And so there is a 40% abandonment rate in cervical cancer. And as some of you might know, cervical cancer is the leading killer of women amongst cancers in the country. And a woman dies every 7 minutes from it. So that's just one disease. And so spouses leaving, when women give birth to children with congenital anomalies, and they are considered, through superstition, it's considered their fault, they're also abandoned. Now that's one way. The other is how Isha has talked about, or Saima has talked about, people just, either because the family has to be isolated, or the patient has to be isolated, or there could be stigma around a particular disease. A lot of people believe in good luck, bad luck. If I go and meet them, maybe their luck will rub off on me. There is also the fact that many illnesses are disfiguring, and the patients themselves might withdraw and cut themselves off from family members and family. Caregivers just don't have time to catch up with friends and people that they used to hang out with earlier. And so there's a huge loss of social relationships at this time. And yes, if there is a huge financial burden, that there might be a tendency for people to also stay awake because they think that they will be leaned on for financial support. We all know that disease in India is a very financially, it has a huge financial impact. A lot of people are pushed towards poverty. Loss of time, in the sense of, I have 24 hours in the day, 18 hours goes towards taking care of somebody, or my time goes in just medicines, hospital visits. That's where my time goes. I don't have any time to spend, to relax with my family, to do the things that I used to love to do before. I don't have that time anymore. Time also in terms of longitudinal time. I thought I would live to be 50 years old. I thought I would, get married, have children, have grandchildren. And hey, I'm 19, I'm sick, and all of that is being taken away from me. Opportunities, very closely associated with what I just talked about, loss of time, loss of opportunity. I was up for a promotion, and now that I have to give up, either because I'm not well enough, or I'm going through a dip in my long-term illness trajectory, or that as a primary caregiver, I cannot afford to move to another city to take up a job that I really love to take up. I had my eye on a particular university or a college that I want to go and study, but that money has now been reallocated towards treatment. So I've lost those opportunities as well. Plans. And a classic example of the loss of plans is COVID-19. How many of you in 2020 thought that by 2025 you would have certain plans accomplished? And what did 2020 do instead? Whatever plans, was there someone who wanted to speak? So whatever plans we have, disease can come and completely derail those plans. And loss of those plans is something that we grieve over. Autonomy, some of you have mentioned dignity and autonomy. And these are associated with personhood. I am no longer the captain of my ship. I am no longer the one who gets to make decisions about my own body, about my, what I'm going to eat, how I'm going to spend my day. It has all been decided for me by other people, including my doctors and my family. And because of all of that, I've completely lost control. I hear from a lot of, adults like myself, who, like people in their late 30s, 40s, God, my father and my mother, or my mother, they're so stubborn. They're so stubborn. It's frustrating. It's frustrating to, I'm trying to get them to take their medication and they just postpone it. Or I'm trying to get them to eat something, but they just won't do it. See, when someone has been in charge of their lives all along and has lost control, they will do whatever they can to grasp onto any sense of control they can exert on their environment. Loss of dignity, as some of you said, when you become a patient. One second, please hold on a second. When somebody is, when we are subjected to the healthcare system, sometimes we're not asked our names. We become file numbers and statistics. and caregivers really are not given that sense of respect or personhood themselves. And apart from that, apart from what is systemically imposed on us, diseases themselves can strip us of our dignity. Having to be put in diapers, having to rely on other people for very, very basic needs, that intimate care needs, that calls on you to be exposed to another human being, whether it's a family member or not. So these are all losses that people experience. And someone said in the chat box as well, just loss of a family, loss of belonging. We lose a functioning member in the family. Someone who played a role, a practical role as well as an emotional role in the family is lost. And all of these things, all of these losses are things that we grieve over. And grief is not just an emotional experience, it is a total human experience. So on your screen now, you can see that I've put it into, into 5 boxes: physical, cognitive, spiritual, emotional, and social. Now, what happens when somebody is grieving? Let's keep the emotion bit aside. Why do we say that grief is a physical experience? Would anyone like to answer that? Why is grief, or how is grief a physical experience, apart from the tears? Anybody?
I could try.
Please.
Grief mimics symptoms of depression. So when you don't really feel like you have energy, maybe you have loss of appetite, lots of sleep, you are not able to focus. I guess that's it. Focus would be more cognitive, but these 3 symptoms at least.
Excellent. Yes, for sure. Physically, it can be, like you said, it can manifest almost, it maps almost as closely to depression as possible. And I'm glad you said that, because we'll be talking about the difference between grief and depression as well, which we did touch upon in the mental health class. Physically, people can feel really heavy. Now, if I were to ask you, and this, I need to just, stop sharing the screen every now and then. If I ask you, where do you feel grief? Where do you feel grief? Where do you feel it? Let's not look at it as professionals. Let's look at it as someone who experiences it. Where do you feel grief in your body? In your heart? Where else? In your mind? Physically, where do you feel it? Physically, where do you feel it? Geeta is describing a full, total human experience, yes. But I want you to be very specific in where do you feel it in your body? Where do you feel it in your body? Headaches. What else? Chest pain. Anything else? Tightness in the throat. Knots in the stomach. Difficulty drawing a breath, sinking feeling in your stomach. Yeah. These are physical experiences. Fatigue. Fatigue. How many of you have a hard time getting out of bed when you're feeling sad? Yeah. Is fatigue something that people feel when you're feeling sad? Some people lose their appetite. Some people eat the comfort food, comfort feeding. Yeah. So that's a physical experience. Okay. And if you even look at poetry, if you look at children, if you ask children to describe grief, they will tell you, they will talk about, something poking them, something hurting them, something making them feel like they can't breathe properly, a sense of claustrophobia. So physically, grief is actually a physical experience. And this is an important thing to remind us that, we can't compartmentalize our bodies and minds and keep them separate from one another. Grief is also a cognitive experience. Isha talked about not being able to focus. And I want you to think of cognition as functional aspects of your, of your cortex. So I cannot function. I cannot think straight. My problem-solving ability is affected. People are asking me all the time, okay, what do we need to do next? What do we need to do next? Do we need to do the death certificate? Do we need to, who do we need to inform? After a while, it's a haze. Like, you cannot think straight. You cannot actively, maybe you don't want to make any decisions, or you can't make decisions, and you're hoping somebody else will come and make those decisions for you. Okay. Negative thoughts, constantly going back to way things played out. And that's sort of getting stuck in that loop of negative thinking. An inability to pay attention. Someone is talking to you, they're saying something, but 2 seconds later, you can't remember what they said. Memory loss, gaps in memory, things like that. Okay. Grief is a spiritual experience, and spiritual, not just in terms of religion, but also in terms of sense of meaning, purpose, hope, and connection. And this can be one of the most intense aspects of grief, because it so much depends on your relationship with the person. How much of your time and mind space and heart space did this person take up? How much of the world did you interpret through this person's thoughts and ideas? How much did they influence your thinking in terms of what was important to you? So a lot of spiritual reactions to grief. Some people might just be angry with God for making them go through this. And even in terms of, like, for a patient, when a patient has lost their ability or their ability to move, they've had a loss of independence. Those are also times when these emotions arise. Emotional, of course, sadness, anger, numbness. Some people might just go numb. And for some people, there might be a lot of guilt because of what they didn't do or what they have done. And of course, grief is a social experience. And yes, Geeta, lots of ambiguity. Thank you for that. A lot of ambiguity. What does this mean? Does this mean anything? Because people will come and tell you, oh, this person is in a better place. Sometimes that doesn't make sense at all. People will come and say, oh, you know what, this is all part of God's plan. Doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. So a loss of meaning is very much a part of the spiritual distress. I'm coming to social aspects of grief. How do we experience grief in a social way? Now, here's where those rituals of mourning become really important, where the family comes together and they take on different roles to look after, I'm talking about bereavement especially. There are certain, rituals that have been handed down, saying, this is the role of this person, this is the role of this person. And so there's really a lot of social dynamics that are going on there. And social support is such an important aspect of how you experience grief. If you have the social support around you from within the family or from friends, from neighbors, that experience of grief can feel very different from if you have to just do it all on your own. Okay, so there is a social aspect to grief. So grief is felt on all domains. It is not just, oh, I'm feeling sad and I don't feel like getting out of bed. It is so much more than that. Okay, and there are many factors that influence how someone will experience grief. Okay, I'm just going to start you off on it, and then perhaps I can, get you all to add your inputs to it. Attachment styles. Now, some of you who are psychologists and counselors are probably familiar with attachment theory. Those of you who are not, there's enough and more literature out there. Mary Ainsworth's study is the one that I usually refer to. Just one moment, please. Sini, I just need to plug in my. Mary Ainsworth, the attachment styles. Now, I won't go into the technical aspects of it, but the crux of it is how you attach to your primary carer as a child largely determines the way you will grieve, how you will interact in relationships, and how will you grieve losses to people who you're really attached to. There are different attachment styles. There's secure attachment where the child has attached in a way that is healthy, that knows when the mother or the father leaves the room that they will come back. And there is a sense of consistency in that relationship. There are avoidant styles. There are styles in which have been influenced by the fact that the parent is very inconsistent. When the child goes for a hug, the child might first be received with a hug, the second time with a little bit of a dismissal, the third time with some animosity. So the child is always on tenterhooks as to what they have to do in order to receive some positive regard from their carer. And as a result, the child might become very hypervigilant, might attach very unhealthily, and so on. So attachment styles at the beginning of life largely will influence how grief is experienced when a certain relationship is experiencing illness and death. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it out there for you, for those of you who are interested and for whom your work might be influenced by this. Please go ahead and read about attachment styles. Family structure. How is the family structured? Who lives together? And this is the structure of the family. We're not talking about the emotions associated. Now, how many people live in the family? So there's a parental unit, there's the sibling unit, there is the parent-child unit. There might be some people in the family who are closer to one another than others. There is always a black sheep of the family who might be on, usually used to solving problems on their own. There are boundaries. Who gets to talk to whom? Who is the head of the family? Are there people who cross boundaries with each other very often, where there's a certain level of, say, over involvement with one another, or complete coldness where you don't talk to one another? And how flexible is the family when it comes to bending these boundaries in a time of crisis or at special times? So family structure is really, really important. Who is in the family? Who are the groups within the families? And how strict are those boundaries between people, and how flexible the family is? There's also communication patterns within the family. This is more of a dynamic. Who talks to whom? Who is the decision maker? Who is the comforter? Who is someone that I can't talk to at all, no matter what, but is ultimately the decision maker? Who is the one with whom I have conflict? Okay. Who are the people who just shut me down if I'm trying to talk to them? Who are the people who really open their arms, talk to me, listen to me, hear me out? And who do we speak to come to a democratic decision? So communication patterns within the family will also influence the way the family and individuals within the family experience grief. How much social support do the families have? There are families who become very isolated and look inwards. There are families who have great social support individually and together with people around them. So attachment style is a very, very individual thing. Family structure is the individual, where they are positioned within the family. Communication is who they talk to amongst the family members. And finally, how much support do they have outside of the family, irrespective of what their relationships are like within the family. So this is from a more social anthropological sort of lens. These are the factors that influence grief. Now, forming attachments with people is a developmental task. It is a task that we as human beings have to accomplish in order to survive. And how we handle separation from attachment figures, depending on the attachment style that we have, could lead to growth or could lead to pathology. If I am overly attached to somebody and that person has suddenly fallen sick and died, I might be in a very, very, very bad place after that, because I am dependent on that person for various things. And while we're all dependent, some people are emotionally over-dependent on certain people in their families. It could be an opportunity for growth. Yes, I was very attached to this person, and there are many lessons I've learned in the looking after of this person. Now I'm going to see this person off, and I'm going to move on with my life in a way that allows me to learn from this. Okay, so there are various ways in which this attachment can play out. And you don't have to be a psychologist to understand the importance of attachment theory, but this is just a framework that I'm giving all of you. Now, there are three facets to grief. How do I experience grief internally? How do I express my grief to other people or to people around me? And finally, how do I adapt to the loss that I have just experienced? Okay, so experience grief, express grief, and adaptation to loss. Now, what do I mean by this? Historically, we would hear this all the time, right? Boys don't cry. I come back to this slide. Boys don't cry. Women are the ones who are able to express emotions more. It's okay for women to cry, but men are supposed to be the ones who are stoic. Have we heard that? Is this familiar? Or are we really woke nowadays and that doesn't apply to us? Is this something that all of us have grown up hearing? Okay, so this sort of division between masculine and feminine ways of expressing grief became a sort of social barrier, because as a man, you might experience extreme distress at the loss of something. But if society tells you, no, you're not allowed to express yourself in a way that you feel, there's a dissonance, right? There's bound to be a problem. How about if, as a woman who's been abused, I'm actually relieved if someone dies? I'm not really crying my eyes out when that loss happens. To me, it might be a release from a very, very difficult relationship that I otherwise could not have gotten out of. But yet, if I'm not mourning in the way that society thinks women should mourn, then I am seen as a misfit. Correct? So over the years, research and has been done into grief, and Docker and Martin, who are these theorists, also talked about intuitive versus instrumental. So they wanted to do away with the gender stereotyping. And so they said, for a little while, they talked about masculine and feminine ways, but they found that was just, keeping that gender stereotyping going. So they started calling it intuitive and instrumental. And what they mean by that is intuitive is more heart, instrumental is more head. Okay. And intuitive, and while we're capable of both, and both exist within us, one tends to be a little bit more pronounced, or we tend to use it in different settings with people we're comfortable with. So intuitive might entail more emotion, more energy invested in affect. I'm able to express my feelings, and I'm able to share my inner experiences, and I'm able to do those things. Instrumental would be when people think more, are more into the cognitive space. They would rather solve problems than discuss feelings. And there are people who live in this space much more than the other. But it is also setting dependent. I can't go to work and start telling all my colleagues and my boss and my clients and my partners about, all my inner experiences and everything. I can't do that, but I can intuitively express myself to a certain number of people who I know I can trust and be close to, and who will guard my feelings, or with whom I'm okay to be vulnerable. Now, most of the time we use a blended heart and head approach, but there is a time when it is dissonant, where the two don't gel. And I gave you an example of that. When society does not allow somebody to express their grief in the way that they experience it, there is dissonance, and that can lead to pathology over time. So when we talk about styles of expressing grief, let's not talk about masculine and feminine or whatever. Let's talk about intuitive and instrumental. Remember that a person can be both. A person can be forced into being one. A person will be different according to the settings. Okay. Now, most people are familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. It starts with denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a pioneer when it came to working in death and dying and grief. And she's the one who really sort of mapped these stages. But over a period of time, they have been misunderstood to be one after the other. These are not stages that we go through in sequence. They're certainly not stages that everybody has to go through. It's not necessary that I have to feel anger or depression or bargaining or acceptance at some part of my journey. I may feel that, I may not. It doesn't mean that once I get past a certain stage, I can't go back to it. I might fully accept the loss of what I have experienced. But 5 days later, I can go back to being angry. So it is not something that happens in sequence. It is certainly not something that happens in a particular order. And it is not necessary that people will go through all 5 stages. Some may skip it. Some may not. Some may keep going back to a particular stage and stay there for longer than others. Now, so that was the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross framework. But I just want to talk to you about Strebe and Shute, and they talked about grief as a 2-dimensional process. And I don't want to, confuse you with too much jargon, but what they really said is grief has 2 ways, has 2 facets again. One is loss orientation, where we're just dealing with the distress of grief. But there is something called restoration orientation, where over a period of time, from our loss, we start focusing on restoring, on getting back to life. And what are some of the examples? Okay, grief work could involve me having to go through all the stuff of the person that we have lost. And each of those things is going to cause me a great deal of distress. Okay, each thing I hold has a memory. Each thing I hold has some sort of profound meaning for me, and all of that. So I take the time to process it and focus on the loss. There will come a time where I have to decide what to do with this stuff. Yeah, I might choose to give something away to charity. I might choose to pass something down as heirlooms. I might choose to, I don't know, just sell something because I need the money. Those are restoration oriented. So all of these are tasks that are grief oriented and restoration oriented. And it goes from minor tasks to larger experiences. Okay. So initially, when I've experienced the loss, everything is grief oriented. Everything is grief oriented. But after a while, it's just a function of life that I have to start focusing more on restoration. For some people, it'll take longer than others. Some people, the instrumental ones, might start getting into that task almost immediately. Okay, let's get the paperwork done. Okay, what do we do with the house? How do we have to transfer the car to this one's name. So these are the people who are probably dealing with their grief in an instrumental way. Okay, so it looks on the surface like they're more about the restoration aspect. There are people who will sit in their emotions for a longer period of time, share memories, do all of that. Sharing memories, telling stories, these are also both grief orientation as well as restoration orientation. Okay, so I hope that is clear. So also it is important to remember that we keep oscillating between grief and restoration. It doesn't mean that we finish the grief work and we automatically start towards moving forward. No. There will be days where we will oscillate, and sometimes we will go back, especially on anniversaries, on special occasions, birthdays, things like that we did together. The chances of me focusing on grief orientation will be higher. And as a therapist, as a counselor, as somebody who works in palliative care, I have to allow for that to happen. If somebody seems to have made progress and then all of a sudden has a breakdown one day, I need to understand that this is what is happening. They are oscillating, and it is all right for them to do that. Okay. And finally, I'm gonna just go through the last framework that I want you to remember. So we've talked about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who talks about the 5 stages, which we now know are not sequential. We've talked about Strebe and Shute, who talk about loss versus restoration. And now we're going to talk about William Worden. And I'm sure the instrumental people will really like this. He comes at it from a task framework. And this concept has its roots in developmental psychology, which I'm sure people like Isha and some of the others here will be very, very familiar with. Development psychology says that in order to move forward, just like a child is required to accomplish various emotional, social, and mental tasks to adapt, so does a person who experiences loss and grief and bereavement. Now, for example, if a child has to, what are some of the developmental tasks that a child has to accomplish? Can someone tell me? In order to make it into adolescence and adulthood, what are some of the tasks that a child has to master? I'm very scared that people are taking an afternoon nap right now. So what are some of the tasks that children would have to master in order to move on and to really adapt to growing up? Anybody? Socialization, Saima says. Anything else? How about walking, talking, rolling over, learning how to, yeah, attachment is one. Yes, that's at an emotional level. Reading and writing, yeah. Okay, that'll come later. Developmental tasks also, problem solving, learning how to understand abstract concepts. There are some cognitive tasks that a child has to accomplish. Yeah. Yes, bladder control, when to use the toilet. So we call it toilet training. When to go to the toilet, when to ask the parents, okay, I need to use the loo, so that they can step out of their diapers. Those are developmental tasks. Okay, now, in order for a child to move forward, they have to be finishing these tasks in order to get ahead. And that's what the developmental psychology framework really tells us. So if we apply that same framework to grief and bereavement, here is where we land. Mastery of one task impacts the mastery of higher order tasks. So what does that mean? How well or how badly I accomplish a certain task will determine how well or how badly I will do on the next one. If as a child, I haven't learned to, fine motor skills like tying my shoelace, it is going to affect a higher order task, like, me getting a little bit more independent, dressing myself, going to school. So mastery of one task impacts the mastery of higher order tasks. And we have to keep going back and revisiting it from time to time to master it. So just like a child is not going to learn how to walk in one day, or learn to ride a bicycle, or learn to, maybe to count or to tell time by looking at a clock. They have to be taught it repeatedly, or they have to go over that ground repeatedly. Similarly, for these grief-related tasks, we might have to revisit these tasks a few times. And these are influenced by mediators of mourning. I'll tell you what those are in just a minute. If I were to put it on a map, this is what William Worden says are the tasks to be handled. Before we can work with grief, we have to accept the fact that the loss has happened. If I haven't accepted that the person is gone or this particular loss has taken place, okay, let's not talk about death and dying. Let's talk about, okay, I'm a patient, I have a particular kind of illness. As of today, I have lost my ability to use my legs. Okay. I have to now transition to a wheelchair. I now am going to need a carer around the clock. It's a huge loss to lose the ability to move around by yourself. In order for me to go anywhere with that, I have to first accept the reality of the loss. Yes, I have to use a wheelchair now. From this point onwards, this is going to be my new reality. I have to be given time to grieve that loss. I can't be given diagnosis or this prognosis, and immediately expected to show up for physiotherapy the next day or find myself in a wheelchair and go for rehabilitation. I need some time to process what this means. Okay. And once I have accepted it, I have at least started the process of grieving this, then I need to adjust to an environment where, well, in this thing it says where the disease is missing, but in my case, where I no longer have the use of my limbs. Okay, I'm going to have to do these things. Now I have to go for physio. Now I have to go for this, for rehabilitation. I need to get myself a wheelchair. I might want to get a motorized wheelchair. So adjust to the new reality. And finally, emotionally and spiritually relocate the loss or the deceased and re-engage with life. Now, this might be a little bit of a complex idea. So let's go back to losing a person. I have lost somebody. I first of all need to accept that that person is gone. I need to be given time to sit with that emotion and say, okay, person is gone. I might go back to being in denial of the loss, but at least I have to start the work. And then I have to start adjusting to an environment where the deceased is missing, which means my day as a caregiver used to be about waking up in the morning, getting the medication ready, making sure that, this tablet was given, some food was given, then something else. Now is the time to give a sponge bath. And now suddenly I have to adjust to an environment where the person is not there. So what do I have to do with this time that I have? And this adjustment period is a long, long time. It can take a whole lifetime for some people. But adjustment is very, very important. As we start adjusting, we start to emotionally and spiritually relocate the disease. Now, I'm going to just stop sharing my screen here because it's just easier to talk directly to all of you. To spiritually relocate somebody, let me ask a question. When somebody dies, does our relationship with them end? Does our relationship with someone die just because the person will die? Geeta and Saima say no. I'm only hearing from the same 4 people in a class of 64. Senior and Shripriya, should I be worried? I mean, not to say that I don't enjoy hearing from Geeta and Isha and Saima and the others, but surely there are more people here. So my question to everybody in this room is, when somebody dies, does our relationship with them end? So far, I have 3 no's.
Not at all.
Not at all. So what happens? What happens to that relationship?
So basically, even though the person is physically absent, because there is a sense of void and we cannot speak to the person anymore, but the memories with the person and the time we spent, it keep like no, it's a kind of loop that we sometimes get stuck there, and it causes haunting us, and whether it is positive or negative feelings, so it might disturb at some point or other. Because I experienced something similar, because when my grandmother passed away in 2016, I had that feeling for almost a year or so. So eventually I could able to cope up, but the thing is, the relationship would continue, I would say, in the sense, but not their physical presence.
Thank you, Ravikant. Yeah, so it's like saying it becomes a memory. Yes. Let me put it another way. I lost my mother. Does this mean that I never had one? I still refer to her as my mother, right? My relationship goes on with her. I am still the daughter of. Now, like some of you said, it's about memories, it's about all of those things. But many people continue to remember them as touchstones. What would my mother have advised me to do in this moment? What, okay, you even rely on memories to guide you in certain difficult decisions. I find myself in a difficult decision, right? I might be angry with her because you left such a big mess for me to clean up. It is still a relationship. I'm still angry at this person, or I'm still missing, or it could be those kind of things. I might fight with them in my head, right? So that is it. The relationship goes on. And over a period of time, that relationship gets relocated spiritually to a place where we're aware of them. Maybe that pain becomes a little less, or that anger becomes a little less, or some of those emotions become less. But the relationship is it. In palliative care, we have something called continuing bonds. That means that after the person has died, our bond with them still continues. How many of us look to a wise old grandparent who, for us, the benchmark of unconditional support is somebody like that person? We measure other people by these people that we have lost. Okay, so the relationship continues. That is what I mean by spiritually relocating. Now, those of you who watch Netflix and stuff, there's a beautiful, there's a really quirky show called Modern Love, and there is a season 2, episode 1, where this lady, her husband has died many years ago, and she's in a very warm, loving second marriage, but she has a scar that belonged to her ex-husband. And every time she wants to talk to him, she takes a drive in that car, because that car was her ex-husband's favorite thing in the world. And that's where she would go. It's like a time machine where she goes to talk to him. It's a classic example of a continuing bond. Okay. There are other ways in which you have a continuing bond. You might open a scholarship in the person's name. You might, you might plant a tree in their name. So you emotionally relocate them to a place that is a little bit more peaceful, that is a little less conflicted, and that relationship still continues. Okay, so I hope I have been able to articulate what spiritually relocating the deceased means. Okay. Now, this is a very, very important slide, in my opinion. You may name your child. Yes, that's true. Okay. This is a very important slide, and I would say that this is a central slide, especially for those of us who are looking to be of help to people who are grieving. Okay, because sometimes we bring our own grief into an equation, and that can become very dangerous, because not everybody grieves the same way. What a loss meant to me is not what a loss means to somebody else. And just because two people have had similar experiences doesn't mean that it's the same experience. A similar circumstance, it doesn't mean that the experience is the same. Okay, so if you are somebody who is who's sitting with someone else who has experienced a loss of a person, here are some of the things that you need to be looking at. Who died? Who died? A mother, a father, a sibling, a spouse, a cousin, a friend, a partner. Who died? Okay. What was the nature of attachment to that person? Did they spend all their time together? Did they take every decision together? Was this person incapable of taking decisions without the other person's advice? Was the other person really dependent on them for all their needs? What is the nature of the attachment, and emotional as well as in terms of time? What kind of death was it? What kind of death was it? Was it a sudden death? Was it an expected death? Was it a difficult death where the person suffered? Was it a death where it was not difficult, but it was at an unexpected time? Was it something that happened out of neglect? Was it something that happened because some intervention wasn't been able to be done in time? What kind of death was it? How does the loss impact the person's sense of self? This is very close to the nature of attachment, by the way, because how does the loss impact the person's sense of self? And you will hear this in the person's description. I am all alone in the world now. There is no one left for me. It could be that now what do I do with all my time? all day, all night, I used to only look after this person. I once met a lady who had been married to this gentleman for 50 years. And not 50 years, maybe 40 years. And it was a he was a very dominant man. He controlled all the decisions. She couldn't move a finger without his permission. And he was diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition. So over a period of time, he couldn't move by himself. He couldn't eat by himself. He lost all muscular function, but he could still think. And in spite of being fairly affluent and wealthy, such was the nature of their relationship, where he was so dominating, and it was abuse of a different kind, where he insisted that they don't have a home nurse and that she does all the work, even though they were an affluent family and they could afford the help. So for him, it was a sense of asserting control over her, even at that point. He died very slowly. It took a couple of years for him to, for one part of him to go. And when he finally died, here was a woman who, after 40 years, suddenly had time to herself, suddenly was in control of her own life. It took us another 6 months for us to get her to go and join like a club, to start going for walks, to go out and meet people, make friends. Now, this is the impact on her sense. And the story I'm telling you is probably a slightly extreme story, yeah? But her sense of self was impacted. What do I do with myself? I don't know. I can't think for myself. I'm used to him making all the decisions. So think of what the person's sense of self is after the person has died. And please remember that not everybody has had a positive relationship with the deceased. There are people who've had very, very difficult relationships, and not everybody is experiencing loss in a way that we might experience loss. Okay. The next mediator of mourning is, what is that person's previous experience with loss? Have they experienced loss before? And if that's the case, how did they cope with that loss? Now, is this the first time they're experiencing death and dying? Is it the 15th time this year? Is it compounded? Did they feel helpless the last time, but more in control this time? So what is their previous experience with loss? And how badly or well were earlier losses handled? And here an important thing is, what facilitated them to handle this loss well? Okay. These will give you an idea of what you can expect now. If they say that, all my previous difficulties, it was this person that actually got me through it, well, this loss is going to be a lot worse. Level of social support is a no-brainer. If we have good social support, it obviously makes the journey a lot easier. Secondary losses caused by the death. Okay, what are secondary losses caused by the death? Secondary losses. Secondary losses. Now, when you lose somebody, what else can you lose? For some people, they might lose a sense of protection from society, from.
It can be also a financial loss in terms of, for example, if the husband has lost his life and maybe the benefits, whatever financial support, the salary is getting, that
Yes.
might be lost for a while.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe permanently. And also social security, emotional security.
Yes. What else? What else?
It can be lots of social support.
Loss of social support, yeah. Anything else? Loss of status?
Yeah.
There could be loss of status. It was this person that was actually maintaining a certain status. Loss of identity in terms of relationships, absolutely true, yeah. All right, so there are always secondary losses. Now, it could also be loss of practical support. He was a person paying all the bills. I don't know how to do it. I've never had to do it. Okay. Or it could be the loss of a parent, a co-parent. Suddenly a man is left with two young children and he has to, and I'm sorry, I'm using gender stereotypical roles myself, but there were certain things that the other parent did, which now this parent has to step in to do, and he or she may not know how to do it. So it's the loss of even a partner in terms of carrying out certain tasks. It could be the loss of a protector, a decision maker, like you said, a breadwinner. Now I've suddenly been left with this full amount of debt, and not only have I lost a steady income, I have also suddenly discovered that my I might lose my home. Okay, so there could be several secondary losses that the person is experiencing. Now, as a counselor, you cannot help people with the tasks of mourning, like accepting the loss, grieving it, adapting to the new reality, and then spiritually relocating this person, moving on, without a thorough understanding of these mediators. So these mediators are something that it's not a checklist. You're going to have to work it in through a conversation. There is going to be rapport building involved, but these are the important, vital signs and vital bits of information that you need in order to truly be able to help the person sitting in front of you. Okay. And grief doesn't exist in a vacuum. As an individual, whatever grief I experience is going to impact my family, and how a family experiences grief, or many families experience grief, will impact the community. We're thinking of, the multiple compounded grief that people in Turkey and Syria are experiencing at the moment. That's entire communities experiencing that grief, and how those communities are supported at this time, either supporting one another or in a larger context, will also impact the future emotional health of this community. Similarly, we've seen in COVID and COVID was a very, very difficult time for many of us, because all the regular ways in which we received support were gone. We were isolated. We did not have the usual people that we could reach out to. We couldn't even hug friends and family. We couldn't say our goodbyes. We couldn't have those prayer services. We couldn't get together and eat together. We couldn't have funerals. We couldn't do all of those things. And the impact of that on communities has been vast. I personally don't think we've fully seen the long-term effects of what that time was really like. Okay. And I'm just going to quickly take you through a few more aspects before stopping. Grief is not always something that is felt after a loss has been experienced. There is something called anticipatory grief. Grief that is felt in anticipation of a future harmful occurrence. Now, those of us who've been long-term caregivers of seriously ill family members, we know that day is coming. Sometimes we can see it coming. And there is a deep sense of grief and poignancy when we see that person not being, maybe a little bit weaker today, maybe not being able to do what they were able to do yesterday. And we know that time is coming. So that is also grief. And even for the patient, they know that day is coming. And this is very important for us to remember, that people who are experiencing a series of these losses, the losses that we talked about, loss of identity, loss of autonomy, loss of role, the roles that they have in families and within society, all of these things warrant grief. And once we have a certain loss, we know other losses are coming, and we're already anticipating those losses. This is a very important thing for us to remember. Don't be quick to go and label someone as depressed. First, you need to understand whether there is an anticipatory grief aspect that is coming up. A lot of people, even when there is collusion, when families have conspired with the healthcare service not to give them information that they have asked for, people very intuitively know that something is seriously wrong. And especially when they haven't had an opportunity to talk to somebody about it, that anticipatory grief can also set in. So anticipatory grief is a thing. So grief can be felt in advance, not only after a certain event has occurred. And anticipatory grief really requires working through fears Fear and anticipatory grief are very closely tied. So if you see that somebody is struggling, there are certain fears that they might be harboring that we need to understand. Okay, what are these fears? Fear of the unknown. I don't know what's going to happen to me after, after the surgery. I don't know what's going to happen to my children if anything happens to me. What happens after death? Suddenly people of deep faith are questioning what they have profoundly believed in all their lives. There could be people who are atheists who are suddenly finding solace because they suddenly need something to hold on to. So that unknown factor of what is going to happen as I get sicker or if my time comes is a huge aspect that you and I need to work through with people that we're trying to help. Fear of loneliness. And loneliness is not just in terms of physical loneliness. The journey of illness is a very lonely one. Because no matter how many people are there walking beside you, you are the one experiencing those losses. You are the one who is no longer able to walk. You are the one who now needs to be washed up and cleaned up after using the toilet. And it is a lonely, lonely place to be. And this fear also of people not understanding that loneliness. And one of the worst ways in which we can make people feel even more lonely is by dismissing their feelings. Oh, don't worry, this is all fine. Don't worry, your whole family is here to look after you. Why are you complaining? Or there is also something called proximal separation, and this happens with a lot of elderly people who might be kept in a family home, surrounded by joint family or whatever. But sorry, just give me a second. So the fact that somebody is surrounded by family does not always mean that they're not lonely. Because there might be 10 people in the house, but very few people sitting and having a meaningful conversation with that person. So that is called proximal separation, when you have people around you. So other people think, why is this person lonely? Everyone is there. Somebody is taking care of the food, someone is taking them for a walk, but is anyone having a meaningful conversation with these people? Someone who is used to being the head of the family, is that person being involved in certain decision making that is happening in the household? Those kind of things. So that is also a very, very, and the silence is loud, yes, Deepa. The fear of loss of family and friends, either during the course of your illness or afterwards. The loss of body function. For many of us, it is a very, very difficult thing to lose the ability to rely on our bodies. My body will not do what I expect it to do anymore. And what if it gets worse? And body function is not just physical bodily function. What if I lose my mind? There are so many patients who have said to me, I don't want to sound like, I don't want to be in a place where I'm incoherent and I'm talking rubbish and I'm delirious. And I have no control over that. I don't want my children to see me like that. Okay. Of loss of identity. This ties back to our first slide. All of those losses that we talked about are also very real fears that people who have been diagnosed with a serious illness have. So please explore those fears, and that's how you will understand how to also help them work through this anticipatory grief. Okay. I'm not going to get into this in much detail because this is a very vast subject, but I want to bookmark this for you. There is something called complicated grief. Complicated grief is basically, I said in the beginning of this class that grief is a healthy response to loss. It's a healthy adaptation to loss. Complicated grief is when it is not healthy, when it is intense and it's long lasting and it overtakes all aspects of your life where the person is not able to function anymore. And it's basically derailed the person's ability to move through life. Okay. And there are three factors that usually impact complicated grief. and one is the nature of the relationship with the deceased person. Okay, again, it could be someone that you were overly attached to, but it could also be that it was a very, very intense relationship where there was a lot of unresolved stuff between two people. Okay, so it could be either very close or very conflicted relationships. Okay, the second is circumstances of the death. If it was unexpected, if it was by suicide, if it was by a drug overdose, if it was by, and let's just face it, COVID, people just disappeared from our lives. We didn't have the chance to mourn them. And the circumstances of the death where we feel like something was stolen from us, that can also be a factor in complicated grief. Events that occurred after the death, and this is it's especially typical of when there is a lot of property dispute, when there's conflict within the family, and the death of this person has further exacerbated the conflict. The person has not left a will, and so now families that were sort of close are now are fighting, they're conflicted. Or it could very well be that you know, people have come to, creditors have come to ask for money that they say that they were owed, and the family has no idea about it. So there could be anger towards the person who has died for leaving such a big mess behind. Okay, it could be so many different things, but events that occurred after the death, circumstances of the death, and nature of the relationship with the deceased person are typically three of the main factors that affect complicated grief. And in 2020, the ICD and the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual included prolonged grief disorder in its lexicon, in its definitions, especially after what and because of what happened during the COVID pandemic. We all believe that there is a pandemic of complicated grief on at the moment, which is still invisible and unrecognized by most people because of the way in which we lost families and friends during COVID. It is quite likely that there is a tsunami of complicated grief that is emerging even as we're coming out of the pandemic. Okay, and finally, I'm going to just take you to one last concept before I stop for the day, and that is disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief. And to me, it's one of the most poignant forms of grief, really, because disenfranchised grief talks about grief that is considered unacceptable by others. My grief that is not recognized by others, or it is not given room by others. Can you give me some examples of what disenfranchised grief might look like?
So it is just like, for example, if someone is, lost someone and they're feeling sad, lonely, and when it is not acknowledged by the people who are around, and then they may take it on a lighter vein when they try to express their grief, or when nobody is bothering them. That could be an example. You're on mute.
That could be an example, but can you give me context in which that might happen?
So the context could be, for example, if there are couples and the children are there, and for example, if one spouse passed away and children were not very close to the spouse who passed away, and they might be ignoring the other parent, in the sense that, okay, he has passed away, there is no point, something like, so is it, the context could be.
It could, yeah,
But
that could be one. Any others? Break up from a girlfriend or boyfriend. Yeah, so a relationship that didn't culminate in marriage. Okay.
Loss of someone that's important to you that society does not accept.
So,
or relationship wise, it's not close, but the person is important to you in some way.
all right, here. Relationship is not recognized by the others because they didn't know you had a relationship. It could be a relationship with somebody that you're not supposed to have a relationship with. In certain communities,
so Mostly, yeah. I was about to tell the transgender community. I think you have said okay.
So it could be that, it could be in intercaste, intercommunal contexts in some parts of the country. It could be someone who is having an affair with somebody else that they're not supposed to be having. It could be homosexual relationships, gay relationships, non-traditional relationships, right? If the deceased person is a convict, thank you. That is really important. Prisoners, someone who has committed a crime. So what else? Someone who has, the way the person died is not as supported as others, like a drug overdose or a suicide. There are some cultures that consider suicide a sin, and they're not allowed to have the same rituals as other people. So that could be one. I'm thinking of all those times when a disturbed individual has gone and maybe, done a mass shooting. And yes, it's a horrific act, but what about the family of that person? Their grief is not considered acceptable because, hey, this person has just gone and done something so horrible. So it's a good thing that he has died. So it's not accepted that there's any grief around them. So those kinds of situations. Also, when it is grief, when it is not a person, beloved animals, how many of us consider our pets our family? And what happens? A small person loses a pet, immediately the family has gone and bought one replacement pet, like as if it's going to make up for the relationship lost with that pet. A failed marriage, or even I've seen cases where there's been a bitter divorce, or there's been a divorce, and then one of the spouses has died, and the family of the deceased has said, no, you're not allowed to come to the funeral. All right, that person has spent 15 years or 20 years with this spouse, but as soon as the marriage is over, that grief is no longer recognized. Okay. Unfulfilled dreams. Now I'm a caregiver. I've spent the last X number of years giving up on my dreams and plans to be able to sit here and look after somebody who's sick in my family. Everyone tells me, God, you're such an angel. You really looked after that person. But in my heart, I'm grieving that in the last 5 years, when I had the opportunity to study something or do something or travel somewhere, I've mourned the loss of that. But somehow it seems selfish to express that, isn't it? Oh, how selfish of you to grieve that when look at what this other person was going through. So you're not allowed to speak about your grief that you were not able to do something as a caregiver. And disenfranchised grief is huge amongst caregivers. Please remember that. So when you're looking at the patient, please also look at the person who survives the patient. Okay. A financial loss or a business loss, a loss of health, a loss of love, of a loved one's functioning. So there are many, look out for disenfranchised grief, okay? And someone who experiences disenfranchised grief a lot are people like the people in this room, healthcare workers, mental health providers, nurses, doctors, volunteers, social workers. We're expected to just pull up our socks and move on because we're supposed to be trained for it. But I also want you to please pay attention to yourselves that you are at very high risk for disenfranchised grief because as professionals, you are not allowed to express the grief that you witness or the grief that you experience, the result of the suffering that you witness. So please also be mindful that one of the highest risk categories for disenfranchised grief are all of you. So I'm going to just stop for now, Senior. For once in my life, I'm going to stop early. So we can take a few questions. We have one more session just to complete the loop of grief and bereavement. Next class, I'll focus more on. I'm going to spend a little time with all of you talking about grief experienced in children, because that's really important. They are also often disenfranchised. And then we're going to move on to bereavement and bereavement support formats. So.
May I ask you a question?
Yes.
Yeah. So No, like what are the do's? I mean, don'ts, especially in the grief counseling. So
Yeah.
generally, this one thing you should know, and also how the process of the counseling of the grief you can better.
Yeah, so we're going to be discussing that next week as well. Today I was just gonna, I think Senior would kick me if I go like 5 minutes overboard again or 15 minutes overboard again. So next week we'll also look at that. So we're going to cover quite a bit next week. We've talked about the theoretical frameworks today. Next week we're going to talk about children. We're going to talk about some of the tools that can be used to assess grief. We're going to be talking about the do's and don'ts. There's a whole slide on that. And then we're going to talk about bereavement. So we'll hold that for Friday. Okay, Ravika?
Thank you.
Oops. Bang on time. So if there are no more questions, maybe does anyone want to share any experiences?
So, ma'am, I think there is no one to share experiences, or I don't think they have any question. So,
Okay, so
Sorry, just one short question.
yes, yes.
You said something about complicated grief, intense and long lasting. Is there something in between phase? Like, I don't know, according to me, grief is, I mean, there's no measurement for grief. It's like, oh, okay, it's about 4 months, 5 months now, you have got over it and get on with your life. And so I couldn't get this complicated grief part. So when you said it's intense and long lasting,
okay, so sorry, my focus is a little
and I'm
blurred.
speaking from my personal experience, so it's not.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Yeah, yeah.
So in the immediate aftermath of the grief, it is acute and intense. There's no two ways about it. Whatever your relationship with the person, whether it was a positive relationship or a negative relationship, the first few weeks, months is intense because there's a lot of this processing of the secondary losses, you know, everything else, relationship dynamics changing within the family, all of that. But over a period of time, if you look at what what the theorists I talked about said, there is a loss orientation, but there's also a restoration orientation. You are still doing tasks slowly, maybe not at first, but eventually over a period of time, you start also focusing, okay, I have to get the children back to school. You know, okay, I need to also attend to maybe my brother who is not feeling very well at the moment, and I need to check in on him. Complicated grief, and for most of us, Geeta, it will take us about a year or so approximately for this acute intense feeling to start to feel less intense. But through it all, we are still re-engaging with restoration activities like, okay, listen, I got to get the bank stuff sorted out, or I need to get this transferred to my name. You're doing those things. In complicated grief, you are unable to do even that. And it derails your functionality to a level where you're not able to re-engage with life. People develop substance use disorders. People become completely reclusive. People are not able to interact with other people. So there is a very, there's a lot of people ask that, how do you know the difference between clinical depression and complicated grief? Typically, we don't assess for depression for up to 6 months after a death has happened. But beyond 6 months, if we find that this person is unable to fulfill day-to-day tasks, which they are required to fulfill for survival, then we're looking at either clinical depression or complicated grief. Complicated grief is still an area that a lot of people are coming to terms with. There might be quite a few overlaps between complicated grief and depression, but then it comes to the professionals to see how to really deal with it. But I hope have I answered your question to some extent?
Yeah, to some extent. Yes. Thank you.
The
Which is-
the key thing is functionality, Geeta. It's functionality. You
Yeah,
can
but it can also happen that you're functional 1 week, the next 3 days you're not functional. That's also possible. So,
but that's not complicated grief. That's natural.
okay,
Natural.
that's what I want. Yeah,
That's loss and restoration.
Yeah,
Your
yeah. That struggle between the two. Yeah,
yes.
thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Any more questions from anyone? So, still we can have the questions in chat box, and I think by tomorrow, we can, I mean, by Friday, we can answer those, if you have any. So, shall we wind up the session now?
Yes, I think so. That's enough grief and bereavement for one day. All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And
Thank you, ma'am.
Yourselves. Take good care of yourselves. Bye.
thank you.